Good afternoon and welcome to NBC's news broadcast. Today is November 6th, 1974. I am Megan Black and with me is Grace Benbrooks. We will be doing a recap of the 1950s and 60s concerning both world and internal events and developments. So to start, we'll be covering the United States' interaction with the rest of the world. So during this post-war era, although the U.S. teamed up with the Soviet Union, fear of communism and the spread of communism was rather common throughout America. After a civil war broke out in Greece between their democratic government and a communist rebel group, President Truman's fear only increased. This led to him issuing the Truman Doctrine, where he stated that the United States would, by any means necessary, prevent the spread of communism. Through the Truman Doctrine, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, had been created with the purpose of defending Western Europe. This doctrine can also be referred to as Truman's containment policy, and because of this promise of containing communism, America was viewed as the world's defender and protector. Another product of this containment policy would be the Marshall Plan, proposed by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, which had aimed to prevent the spread of communism into Western Europe and stabilize international economies to develop political democracy and create free market economies. This was accomplished through the donation of money towards European recovery and opening up American businesses in European markets. This plan successfully stabilized European politics and helped Western European nations fight against communism. Although the Truman Doctrine proved successful in some areas of the world, it did not work well in Asia, specifically China. China had been in a civil war off and on again for many years between nationalist forces led by nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek that were backed by the U.S. and communist forces led by Mao Zedong that were backed by the USSR. When the Civil War finally ended in the late 1940s, the communist forces had won. The victory of the communists and the subsequent creation of the communist regime in China upset the balance of power in Asia, and it was theorized that maybe the Soviet Union and China would combine to form a single communist state. In the aftermath of World War II, the Allies had to decide how the once Japan-controlled Korean peninsula would be governed. The Soviet Union and the United States then entered an agreement to control the peninsula in a joint trusteeship, without consulting the two Korean political parties, those whose leaders then objected. Political leaders Syngman Rhee, who was backed by the U.S., and Kim Il-sung, who was backed by the Soviet Union, then decided to organize their own country with the intention of uniting Korea under a democracy or a communist government. After the United States announced that South Korea would not be defended by the United States, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung moved to invade South Korea with permission from the Soviet Union. This invasion caused the Korean War, and the United States then decided to extend their containment policies to include South Korea. After 3 years, the United Nations were able to stabilize their fighting along the 38th parallel. However, no peace treaties have been signed, and the two countries are still hostile. With tensions running high throughout the United States, many people used the fear of communism as a way to gain power and recognition, specifically John McCarthy. John McCarthy was a Republican senator who intended to focus his re-election campaign around the fear of communism after World War II. He blamed President Truman on losing China to communism, claiming that his administration was too soft on communism. He also theorized that communists had invaded the Department of State and were trying to shape. John McCarthy was a Republican senator who intended to focus his re-election campaign around the fear of communism after World War II. He blamed President Truman on losing China to communism, claiming that his administration was too soft on communism. He also theorized that communists had invaded the Department of State and were trying to shape U.S. foreign policy to favor the Soviet Union. After President Eisenhower took office, McCarthy attempted to hold investigations to prove his ideas and bolster his political career. However, these trials backfired and even caused the coining of the term McCarthyism. McCarthyism is a negative term for baseless accusations. As soldiers were returning from the war, many of them were left unemployed and without a college education. Congress passed the GI Bill to reward returning soldiers and protect them. This bill gave low-interest loans for housing and starting new businesses, and it also provided financial grants to those who wanted to go to college. The increase of money put towards housing led to more suburban housing developments popping up around the United States, one of them being Levittown, New York. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, many people decided to not get married or start a family due to the financial crisis during the Great Depression. After World War II, there was a baby boom because of the large number of people waiting before starting a family, a desire for normalcy, and the belief in a prosperous and comfortable future. The children born in this era would then go to shape popular culture in their teenage years. The National Interstate and Defense Highways Act was passed in 1956 with the intentions of creating a highway system for the fast transportation of troops and supplies. This act was also efficient in creating more direct ways to get to centers of high population around the U.S. The National Interstate and Defense Highways Act allowed for more suburban housing developments in towns to pop up. Now, after the break, we'll head over to Grace, who will be covering the 60s.
Kool-Aid, a 5-cent package makes 2 quarts of Kool-Aid, 9 great flavors they make you love. Kool-Aid.
For the very best drink you ever made.
Kool-Aid.
Be sure that the envelope says
Kool-Aid.
You can give your youngsters a lot of pleasure with Kool-Aid. You know it's pure and good. It has the Parents Magazine seal. And it's so thrifty. A 5-cent package makes 2 full quarts. Just add Kool-Aid to water with ice, add some sugar, and stir.
For the very best drink you ever made.
Be sure that the envelope says
Kool-Aid.
From Lieber House in New York City comes the greatest skincare discovery of our time. Its name is Dove. This amazing new bath and toilet bar is actually 1/4 cleansing cream. Every bar of new Dove is 1/4 cleansing cream. Ordinary soap dries your skin, but Dove creams your skin while you wash.
Make a simple test. Wash 1/2 of your face with soap, any soap. Rinse thoroughly, and then notice how dry your skin feels after using soap. Now wash the other half of your face with amazing new Dove. No after feeling of dryness now. Your skin has a velvety, just creamed feeling.
That's because Dove creams your skin.
While going over the 1960s, one of the topics we will go over is the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution was a large revolt led by Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement. They revolted against the government and its dictator at the time, Fulgencio Batista. Fidel Castro later took over as the dictator of Cuba and drove Cuba even further into communism. Now, let us switch the topic and go over the Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion was a failed attempt by the U.S. to reverse Castro's revolution. In order to carry this out, the U.S. sponsored Cuban exiles to go invade northern Cuba and reverse the Cuban Revolution. This battle, however, only ended up lasting 3 days and ended with the U.S. losing. Further down the line, something even bigger came into play at this time and is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis during the Kennedy era was an intense back-and-forth argument between the U.S. and the Soviet Union about Cuba having missiles. Eventually, after sending many letters back and forth, the Soviet Union sent a letter to Kennedy, the president of the U.S. at the time, stating that they would remove missiles from Cuba if the U.S. would promise not to invade Cuba. The domino theory, when looking at the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War, they were worried about the spread of communism, that the used a term called the domino theory, which is basically a theory stating that if there is a communist country, they will start to spread communism to surrounding areas and countries. At the time, the U.S. believed that as communism spread from China to Korea and then Vietnam, the U.S. began to worry that the spread of communism in Vietnam would lead to it spreading to other countries like Laos and Cambodia. Gulf of Tonkin Revolution was what actually gave the president the ability to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia while not needing a formal declaration of war. Viet Cong at the time stated they started to intensify their attacks on South Vietnam. That is when President Johnson sent U.S. troops to South Vietnam to protect the U.S. bases in and around Vietnam. The growing opposition against the U.S. being in this big war was becoming bigger and bigger of a problem in the U.S. Many were opposed to this war because the extensive U.S. TV coverage in Vietnam on the war. Many people also used moral arguments against the Vietnam War. One group mainly known for going against the idea of the U.S. being in the war were hippies. Hippies mainly were against the war because they believed that mainstream authority was at the root of society's problems, especially being behind the U.S. involvement in the war. The Tet Offensive of the General Offensive was a series of surprise attacks carried out by the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are forces sponsored by the North Vietnamese. These series of attacks were considered to be a turning point in the war, bringing citizens a different outlook on the Vietnam War. The 1960 presidential TV debate. The 1960 presidential debate was between candidates Kennedy and Nixon. They nationally televised 4 of their debates. With these people started to take, in fact, physicality. With that being the fact, Kennedy's popularity took off as he gained more and more supporters. Listeners on the radio, however, stated that they perceived Nixon as a lot more skilled to become president. Through this debate being televised showed that looks were now becoming a big factor in the number of votes each candidate received. Now looking at the launching of the Sputnik. It was photographed by U.S. intelligence while it was launching. They were photographed using spy planes. This caused a great outcry within the U.S. about the fact of the USSR accomplishing this before the U.S. did. Space race came immediately after as the U.S. raced to catch up to the USSR. This brought a dramatic increase in government spending in things like science and education to better help the U.S. in this space race. The creation of NASA was another thing that was sparked after the Sputnik was photographed. NASA, also known as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was created as a national space program. This brought on the race to the moon. This was mainly a competition between Russia and the U.S., and the U.S. brought the victory home when Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. How Sputnik led to technological and educational advances through the launching of the Sputnik. Funding towards education and science took off, and it inspired scientists and engineers, which eventually led to the creation of the internet.